Hi, I am Carla Ali, and I will be your lecturer for this course, Law 3990, Legislative Drafting. Today, we are going to be discussing the different types of legislation. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to identify the different types of legislation, describe the structures and features of each type of legislation, draft at least one of each type of legislation, assess the powers that may be delegated, and explain challenges in drafting legislation. So let's begin. There are two main types of legislation. These are primary legislation and subsidiary legislation. Primary legislation refers to the substantive law. This type of law contains the basic principles relevant to the topic. So it sets up the framework and it is the basis of the law on a particular topic or in a particular area. So the features of primary legislation are that they are made by the Parliament or the State Assembly, or essentially that body or organ within a state or country who has the power to make legislation. Primary legislation provides a framework for the law on a particular topic, and it sets out the penalties for infringing that law. There are two main types of primary legislation. The two main types of primary legislation are bills, as is shown on the left, and acts, as is shown on the right. The difference between a bill and an act is that a bill is the draft form or version of an act. A bill is what is prepared in the first stage by the person charged with responsibility for preparing legislation in a country, and that bill is then considered by the organ of the state, such as the Parliament or the State Assembly, who's responsible for making legislation, and that bill is then passed or voted on, and where it is approved by the Parliament or State Assembly, that bill then goes through an authorization process to become an act. Subsidiary legislation is known as secondary legislation or delegated legislation. Why? Well, let's see. Let's look at the features of subsidiary legislation. The features of subsidiary legislation are that subsidiary legislation is made under a piece of primary legislation. So you would normally see a notation on the subsidiary legislation stating that it was made under a particular act. Now, when we say made under, what we mean is that the power to make a piece of subsidiary legislation is placed in the act. So the act must say that something may or may not happen, and then it must also say that any further details or clarification of anything said in the act will be done by or in subsidiary legislation. So that is where the subsidiary legislation will get its power to be made and to discuss the matters in further detail. Therefore, subsidiary legislation adds details to the framework which is set up in primary legislation. Subsidiary legislation is also different from primary legislation in that it is not made by the Parliament or State Assembly. It's actually made by a functionary, such as a minister or a board. So, the primary legislation must say who is the functionary that has the power to make the subsidiary legislation. Subsidiary legislation, therefore, is used to explain technical, administrative, and procedural matters that are discussed or set out in a framework in primary legislation. Subsidiary legislation, also a very important feature of subsidiary legislation, is that when it is published, it's published as a legal notice, a statutory instrument, or a government notice. Some examples of subsidiary legislation. Well, there are notifications, rules, regulations as shown on the slide, proclamations as shown on the slide, and orders. These are just some of the different types of subsidiary legislation, but they all have similar features. So that brings us to one of the main challenges in drafting legislation, and that is, what should we do? Which piece of legislation should we draft? Should we draft a piece of primary legislation or a piece of subsidiary legislation? Well, the main fix or the main way to figure out the answer to that question is to determine who is given the power to make the legislation. Is it a matter that requires oversight of the Parliament, such as imposing a penalty or a fine? Or is it a matter which a minister or board can address, such as setting out the dates, times, and procedures for meetings of a council? So we're essentially asking ourselves, who has the power? So let's review what we learned today. There are two main types of legislation. Each type of legislation has different features from the other. But the distinguishing feature between the types of legislation is the agent who's given the power to make that specific type of legislation. And here are some readings that will be useful in helping you to learn about the different types of legislation, the features of each type, and they may also give you some examples of the different types of legislation. Thank you for joining me for today's lecture, and I hope you learned about different types of legislation and what's particular or peculiar to each. Bye.